Hello, I'm here with my friend Nelson Parry, and I'm Mike Best, and I'm here with Josh Grainer from RdV Vineyards in Virginia. So we're very, very excited to host Josh here. Josh is the winemaker at his estate, and we are going to kick straight off with question number one.
So Josh, probably for many people who are listening, even the fact that they make wine in Virginia is a news completely. We would like to know a bit more of the history of Virginia, where the vineyards are located, what varieties were planted, how much under vine there is, the size of the industry, but most importantly, how your estate fits inside the history of winemaking in Virginia.
Awesome. Mike, Nelson, I'm so pleased to be here. Thanks for having me. Love to talk about Virginia. We actually have a pretty long history in terms of the United States here. And so it all actually begins with the first colonists arriving in Jamestown. So on the eastern edge of the United States. And there was actually a decree by the House of Burgesses that required each male colonist to plant 20 vines. Now we have to kind of acknowledge that where these original colonists landed was very swampy Atlantic climate, and with all kinds of new pests and animals to set them back quite a ways. So it never really got off the ground, but the passion never left. And so moving forward a little bit, late 1700s, our founding fathers, individuals such as Thomas Jefferson, were trying to establish vineyards, actually with the help of some Italians, and get things going on the mountains out here in the western part of the state. Again, there was a number of setbacks that kind of kept the industry from succeeding at that point, and the most notable ones being phylloxera and things such as powdery mildew, stuff that Europe hadn't yet seen, but we would introduce in a few short decades. And then more recently, with American prohibition and that sort of thing, it always kept the industry from evolving greatly. But we have a similar trajectory actually as the Willamette Valley in Oregon, meaning that in the late 70s, early 80s, what we consider the modern Virginia wine industry got off the ground. What Virginia has always benefited from was its proximity to Washington, D.C. and the rather affluent coastal communities. And so what that's meant is it's a very regional market to date, in the sense that it's hard to ignore the efficacy of direct-to-consumer sales. And so most of Virginia wine gets drunk within 100 miles of where it was produced. And so unlike the Willamette Valley, who had Oregon and maybe Seattle, they quickly had to kind of identify a regional identity, Pinot Noir, bring it up to a quality level that one could compete against California or the wines of Burgundy, and then take that show on the road. Whereas Virginia, we were both blessed with and cursed with kind of staying local and staying small in that sense. So hence the reason most of your listeners may have never even realized that Virginia is producing wine at this point. So now kind of moving into the current day model, the really high quality wine is grown all throughout the state, but the really high quality producers are what I would say in the western end of the state. As we move inland a couple hundred miles, we hit the Piedmont region of Virginia, which are the foothills to the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains that run north and south across the state, and then into the Shenandoah Valley, which is rockier soils, more mineral-driven soils that are producing wines of greater concentration and ripeness.
So if we would have to do like a history of winemaking in Virginia, looking at producers, when we say, for every region, we always have like a couple of names. Is there anyone that was considered by you guys like the trademark or someone to follow, or let's say that the winemaking models were coming from outside, so maybe you were looking towards more California and what is happening in Napa, for example?
It's a good question, Nelson. And so Again, kind of going back to that 70s, 80s, there's been a couple pioneering producers within the state that are still doing really well. Down in the central part of the state, there's a producer called Barbersville, and they're actually owned by an Italian family, the Zonin family. They invested there in the 80s and have continued to produce a lot of both Italian-inspired wines, varieties such as Nebbiolo and Fiano, but also with Bordeaux-styled wines, so Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, etc. Up in the northern part of the state, another really well-regarded producer is a gentleman named Jim Law of RdV Vineyards, leaning into a little bit higher elevation production. So we're now talking around 1,200, 1,500 feet at elevation, producing Chardonnays, but also producing, again, that Bordeaux-style red wine. And so particularly with RdV Vineyards, when we formed ourselves back in 2006 is when we established our vineyard. We looked at those two producers and said, hey, they've done a great job. We admire them greatly. We have a little more understanding about site selection and just new vineyard material and so forth in these days. So how can we take that to the next chapter that they've built upon? And so what we decided was we spent 2 years actually searching for this rather unique site. We are located in the northern part of the state, about an hour west of Washington, D.C., on this really rocky granite knoll just kissing the Blue Ridge Mountains. Got these beautiful 25-30% slopes to the south-southeast, and developed a wine style based off of Bordeaux at this point. And that wine style is largely linked to the similarity in seasonal moisture and temperature that Bordeaux would have.
Question number 2. This actually came up in this year's diploma exams, so that doesn't mean necessarily that Virginia won't appear in the D6 for another 20 years. It means you need to be cognizant of all the wines of the world. And the question was, Josh, I don't know how you'd fare with this question, but the word for word it is, what are the environmental challenges faced by wine producers in Virginia? And so we'd like to hear some more about this.
Sure, Mike, and it's my personal mission to make sure that D6 brings Virginia back into the conversation much quicker than 20 years from now. So in terms of environmental conditions, I had referred to Bordeaux as kind of being a model for us and a lot of growers in the state. And that's because we have seasonal moisture throughout the year. And so we have reliable moisture every month of the year, equating to almost 700 millimeters of rain on average through the growing season. So that's April through October in our hemisphere. And of course, with that brings two main issues to the industry, and the ones that initially thwarted the colonists' efforts and continue to challenge producers that perhaps have not selected the most conducive sites for it. And that's dilution and disease pressure, specifically during the growing season and at the harvest point. And so disease pressure would come down to the mildews that we're all fairly familiar with. So downy mildew being a big one. And then, of course, rot potentials if those rainstorms happen to come during the September-October timeframe. And of course, in that latter time frame, if we're picking up moisture on the vines, producers in more water retentive sites can have issues with dilution and so forth.
What would be really, really helpful is to get, and maybe you're going to come to this, a couple of very, very specific, kind of concise examples of what you or other producers or the sort of general form is of how do you deal with that as an extreme, and what are the effects of sort of ravaging downy mildew, and how do you mitigate against it?
With downy mildew and disease pressure like that, a lot can be mitigated through really good site selection and a really attentive viticulture. And so Virginia is unforgiving of both bad site selection and the lazy grower. You have to be a very good grower to get top quality fruit here. And that means a lot of handwork, a lot of canopy management to keep the vines clean, and then having soils that are both sloped. It's almost impossible to grow great grapes on flat land out here, and also with really free draining. So Virginia is almost like looking at a tie-dyed shirt when you look at the soil maps. It's a very old geology, so it swirls and mixes. And so a lot of times what that equates to is very small vineyard sizes, but with hopefully the grower selecting the most conducive soils to getting rid of the moisture that is in excess of the plant. On the counter aspect of it, though, Mike, I do want to touch on the fact that while we have moisture and we need to do a lot of input in the vineyard to manage that disease pressure, another big topic within the world right now is regenerative ag and regenerative viticulture. And a lot of what my colleagues in drier places are working to achieve, Virginia achieves very naturally. So it's, in my opinion, one of the most diverse ecological systems I've seen in terms of viticulture. It's highly healthy soils a lot of times because moisture is bringing life. And yes, it brings challenging aspects to the vineyard, but it's also bringing a lot of positive. And so it's the attentive grower, the observant grower that's monitoring that and adjusting accordingly. So oftentimes you'll see permanent cover crops as part of the management behind our viticulture here, as well as just that really high touch viticulture.
We've seen in Europe in 2024, sort of, in a mainstream way, downy mildew being an incredibly strong factor on relatively poor growing season, depending on where you've been. But and the effects of that, I mean, you're speaking from the experiences in England, which obviously is a very marginal climate, but particularly in the West where it rained more, you just end up with a place that has very little leaf cover to begin with, and then when those leaves are gone, it's not even about the grapes. Right? Once you've lost the leaf cover, you can't photosynthesize, you can't ripen, and you are basically stuck. Then that isn't, you're in a relatively cool climate. It's not going to ripen. So I guess that importance of being on top of spraying, of that kind of disease management, of opening up the canopy, of having the trellis set up in the right way. You can't really name one factor, I suppose, or can you? I'm guessing here, but I'm sort of putting words in your mouth. I don't really think there's one particular thing that is the key. It's the mix of all of them. Is that right, or do you have any else to say on that?
Mike, you're hitting it right on the top of the head. So, very attentive spray programs, and Virginia is a challenge in the sense that with vinifera grapes in organic viticulture, it's a real difficulty. And it becomes a question of not necessarily being able to manage downy mildew with copper. That's possible, but it becomes a question of sustainability. How many times are you going to put that tractor through the vineyard? How much copper are you going to apply? The carbon footprint, the vineyard compaction, and that sort of thing. So most growers honestly choose to have more of what we would call a conventional program to approach these, such that they feel it's a bit more of a sustainable program in our climate, as well as almost everyone's growing on that very laser thin vertical shoot positioning to get as maximum sunlight and airflow, as well as management of cover crops. So we're farming the ground cover as much as we're farming the grapes sometimes to kind of steer the vigor within the plant. And then, yes, meticulously managing the leaf and fruit to ratio balance and that sort of thing to ensure really nice airflow, proper sunlight infiltration. It's almost the opposite of California, where they're seeking shade and humidity. We're seeking the sunshine.
I wanted to switch to varietals. I guess that by having such an extreme climate, it might be harder than to make consistent Cab Sauv, but at the same time it will be easier to make a good amount of Merlot, which is something that we don't do anymore. If you think about it, Bordeaux, Bulgari, Napa, making Merlot is becoming like a hassle. How this climate really selects the final blends for you guys?
Yeah. And so you're exactly right, Nelson, in the sense that Merlot is one of the top 3 most planted varieties in the state. I believe it's either number 1 or 2, right up there with Chardonnay, like most places in the world. But What Merlot does do, especially in our climate, is it's a bit more forgiving of moisture. It wants a bit more moisture than Cabernet Sauvignon. So it's only but the droughtiest sites that really excel with Cabernet Sauvignon, where Merlot can start to reach that level of ripeness without over ripeness. I would argue that Virginia right now, you really have to seek out and search for overripe wines. Traditionally, our wine style on the critical edge, let's go back 20 years where it was much cooler and we didn't have as good a site selections. The Virginia wine was known to be a bit too herbaceous, a bit too vegetal. We're now finding that sweet spot where we can get nice bramble fruit ripeness, a crispness, but without a heaviness or a lack of energy behind the wines. And so we're in a pretty sweet spot now. And again, kind of coming back to the future of it, between site selection and proper rootstock selection, we can continue to manage the varieties such as Merlot for a number of decades, I believe. And it is a good grape for the state.
Even if the bottle has 14% alcohol, the thing that is surprising to me is that I can feel the ripeness of the fruit, but I don't feel the alcohol at all.
It could be interesting just to kind of describe the wine, as most of the consumers haven't probably tasted a Virginia red wine before. And what I've found that when I work with my colleagues in California and I share my wines from Virginia, they say, oh, fantastic, very, very old world. And what they're meaning by that is there's that medium bodied, that savoriness behind there, a little bit more freshness perhaps than that kiss of sunshine that some of them are achieving on the West Coast. And then when I take to my colleagues in the Bordeaux, they get a ripeness that they distinctively find sweet without sugar, but sweet in the sense of generosity that they may not have in Bordeaux. And so it's this interesting middle ground. We're warmer than Bordeaux, but cooler than California with less sunshine hours. And so there's this middle ground where if Bordeaux is this earthy, savory component, we're more of this bramble savory component versus this very rich blackberry component, if you will, of the West Coast of the United States.
Okay, interesting. That's cool. And obviously we can't talk about everything about the wine, but just the color, and I guess, having tasted lots of wines, this is strikes me as a high pH wine. It's quite purple. It's kind of soft, plush, voluminous kind of style. Yeah, strikes me as that. So high pH is a feature of Virginia winemaking. Is that fair?
That is a fair comment, Mike, and that has to go back to our climatic conditions. And so oftentimes high rainfall soils will produce a lot of potassium in them. And if you'll allow me to get a little bit nerdy at this point.
Please do.
All right. High potassium means it gets taken up, it gets mobilized very readily into the plant. And what that means is that those grapes come in with a large amount of potassium in them. And now when we put them in the fermenters with red wine, it's all on the skins, right? That potassium gets released and acts as a buffering agent against the pH. And so what that means is a wine picked at a pH of 3.4, 3.5, sitting on the skins can easily climb to 3.7, 3.8, 3.9, just by the release of that potassium. Many of the winemakers in the state will choose to adjust that pH back down to what in enology we would consider a stable state below 3.7. And basically what that's doing is making it more microbiologically stable. The challenge with that is we can start to create this sweet sour component. And so I don't know if sweet tarts are a thing for everybody, but it's a type of candy here in the US that has this very acidic but also sweet kind of component to it. And it can throw the wine out of balance. So particularly here at RdV, we choose not to do that. We choose to accept the wine as it is, don't make an adjustment to the wine. And so it does have a bit of an elevated pH. I think the wine still shows a unique profile of freshness behind it, which maybe is attributed to the granitic soils. I find that in Côte Rôtie, Beaujolais, Alsace, all the way up into Austria, that these granitic soils provide a certain energy that sometimes can't be explained by their chemistry. Another side topic we can go off on another podcast. But that being said, we'll accept that, and then we're just what it results in is us needing to be very attentive in the cellar. And what I mean by that specifically is to monitor Brettanomyces or any other spoilage mechanisms that can survive in such high pH wines and ensure that they don't take a foothold. Very clean, very attentive winemaking behind it.
What is the correlation then between, at least when you're looking at the data, between the pH and the total acidity then? Because the wine itself, I mean, I can still salivate. Is not the biggest waves of saliva that I've ever had in my life, but it's pretty constant and it never leaves. So for sure, this is a wine that many people would at least consider, at least a medium plus. So how does that happen?
Yeah, and so it doesn't necessarily equate to a loss of acidity when the pH goes up. And so you need to add acid to get the pH to come down. But the acid balance of those grapes that were picked at 3.5, 3.6 pH will still largely remain in there. And so we're retaining our acid. But with the potassium, it's not a factor of necessarily ripeness. It's a factor of the potassium that's elevating the pH. So we retain the beautiful freshness behind it. And that's why I choose not to make any adjustments, because in my sense, Nelson, as you point out, I believe the acid balance is already there in the wine.
It is worth pointing out that, yes, it's possible to have high acid, high pH wines, even though as confusing as that might seem face value.
A perfect example of those high acid, high pH wines would be a Mosel producer will choose to leave, some of the greatest Mosel producers will choose to leave their skins in contact with the grape, like a Riesling grape, to elevate the pH, to get potassium out of it, such that the fermentations or the pH is a little more conducive to fermentation at that point. And so we're dealing on the opposite end of that spectrum, but it's a tool used around the world.
So there we go. We've just been drinking 2021 RdV Rendezvous with Joshua Grainer, and the 3 questions today were about the history of Virginia's winemaking, environmental challenges faced by wine producers, and potassium and IPH in wine. Joshua, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's been my pleasure, guys. Thank you.